Thank you for joining the Research 101, a proper deep dive panel at this year's Right Hive Con. Today we're talking with three amazing authors about research. Research for your books, research for your short stories, for whatever you're writing. If you could take a moment and introduce yourself, why don't we start? I'm just going to go down the line with Ari.
Oh, goodness. Um, okay. Hi, everybody. I am Ari Augustine. I'm a writer of mostly dark speculative fiction and poetry. I work as a freelance editor. I'm working with a small gaming company at the moment, but I'm hired by all. Let's see. I am also the creator of Bookish Valhalla, which is a blog that tries to connect readers with authors and publishers, and this year our goal is mostly indie authors so we can boost them further into the heavens. And what else? I'm really bad at my own bio, but I do lots of writing, lots of reading, lots of editing, lots of gaming, and I'm just here to talk and have fun with you guys and share information. So, hi.
Hello, my name is Ayana Gray. I am an author of speculative fiction, mostly in the young adult space. And my debut, Beasts of Prey, which is a young adult fantasy, will publish this fall, September 28th, 2021. It is what I call a Pan-African inspired fantasy that follows two teenagers who trek into a magical jungle to hunt down the monster that has been menacing their city for nearly a century. And in addition to that, I'm also the 2021 managing director for Pitch Wars, which, if you're not familiar with Pitch Wars, is an annual writing mentorship program in which mentees are matched with a mentor and work together for 3 months to polish a manuscript and get it ready for ultimately an agent showcase that happens in February of the next year. And that gives aspiring authors an opportunity to potentially be matched with a traditional literary agent to move forward in the publication process. And so that is something else I do when I'm not reading and writing or watching Formula One racing. I also, if you follow me on social media, will probably see me squeal with delight and talk about my 3,000-pound toddler, who is a baby rhino named Apollo, who I adopted a little over about a year ago. He lives in Kenya with the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, and I'm very interested in animal conservation. And so I absolutely adore him since I don't have children or pets of my own right now. But that's me.
I didn't even know you could adopt animals. I should go adopt a lemur.
Oh, absolutely. I can recommend some places. It's great fun.
I didn't know that that could be done. I thought that, like when you see it on the TV in the middle of the night, it could be a little dodgy. So I didn't know that that was actually a thing. So thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Yuchi, and I do creative nonfiction as well as young adult fiction. So currently, I'm working on a Chinese historical narrative nonfiction family saga, and it traces approximately 300 years of Chinese history through my mother's Manchurian lineage. And what ties all of my ancestors and relatives' stories together is the ancient Beijing courtyard that my mother grew up in. The courtyard is the heart and centerpiece of the story. Every family member is connected to it somehow, whether they were born there or grew up there or visited or shared a meal there. So I had to do a lot of research for this project. So I'm really excited to maybe share some insights and things I learned along the way in this panel. I also do young adult, and my contemporary young adult was selected as a Rev Pit winner last year, which is like, I guess, a smaller version of kind of like Pitch Wars, but instead of authors mentoring the mentees, it's professional editors, and then there's also like a agent showcase at the end, and that was a really wonderful and rewarding experience. So aside from reading and writing, I love to travel. I did a Fulbright in South Korea. I've lived abroad in Taiwan and Japan as well as um the UK. And yeah, like Ari, I also love video games. Like the Zelda series is probably one of my favorite series of all time. I love indie games too, like Undertale. And yeah, so really excited to get to know everyone better and excited to be here.
When someone says you should do research for a story, what does that actually mean?
So I'm bad about jumping straight in. I don't want to talk over anyone, so feel free to be like, Ayana, stop talking. I guess for me, research, because I do research both in writing and then in my quote unquote day job, research is asking questions. And I think starting with one question that then, if you have kind of the true heart of a researcher, usually one question will lead to more questions and fun answers, and sometimes take you down rabbit holes and trails that you weren't expecting. But it's really just questioning, which I think is a really natural human thing to do, to ask why and how and where and what if, and seeing kind of where the answers take you.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it really depends on the project that you're working on, and depending on the scope of it and what you're trying to achieve with it, the research could branch into so many different areas. I think one area that it's especially valuable in is in world building. Um, so making sure you bring the scene to life, I think delving into research could be really useful for that. Um, so I Mine is historical nonfiction, and so of course I never lived through the Qing dynasty or like the Republican era of China. And so I relied a lot on research to kind of identify what were people eating during that time. How did they dress and what was kind of the way of life during that period. And I did like a bunch of both primary and secondary source research. So, of course, I interviewed relatives and used a lot of that oral history, but also supplemented those narratives with research from academic textbooks, history books, as well as stories from that time period to add richer texture, to kind of weave it all together to really bring those scenes to life, so it feels like you're there.
Um, let's see. Everyone's pretty much said a lot. um, I think of the Neil Gaiman quote that he has about how you should look at it through a reporter sort of lens. That's not verbatim. So I think Ayana hit it on the head with it being about like asking questions, because that's kind of where at least I start with my research, is asking a multitude of questions, and those questions kind of branch out into even more detailed questions. Um, but honestly, I feel like research could be anything. It could be as simple as looking up names for a character or thinking of book comps, looking for book comps. Anything like that. But it could also mean, as you two pointed out, going deeper into the history and the culture and the location and time periods. And I would add even language is really good source of research that could be included in it. Um, Last year, I think it was early last year, the end. My time is all over the place. But sometime last year, I took a class on Tolkien, and we had to do like a conlang mythology building sort of thing. And that really got me interested in how language is a part of culture, and got me thinking differently about how to apply that to my own stories. And so when I sat down to revise the current story that I'm working on, I was much better prepared in the sense that I started to learn the language that was based in it. So I was taking Japanese for the last 2 years, and so that's been very helpful with my Godflower book. But I think research can be pretty much anything, as long as you have a question and there's an answer in the world, or you want to make up the answer. Then I think that that's considered research. And I would also add one last point, that I think personal experience is definitely considered research, and also reading other genres. Like if you're interested in writing, a genre that's different than yours, it's considered research to kind of go out of your way to read those, to familiarize yourself with them. So I think it's a very broad term that can encompass many things.
So, because research, I mean, encompasses so much, it kind of answered my second question, which is what types of stories or books should you do research for? But it seems like from your answers, everything you write, you're basically researching because you're living the research is basically
Yeah.
what I'm hearing. I mean, I know there's more deep dives, but you're living it day to day, and so really you're researching constantly almost.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If I can jump in, I wanted to say that like any story can be researched, but not all have to be. But the more I looked at the different genres, I was like, wait a minute. They all require some level of research, even if it's just personal experience. So yeah, definitely. You hit it on the head.
So I guess then I'll jump to the next question, which is where does one begin? What are some good sites, or how do you start wrapping your mind around research?
Yeah, I can add a thing or two. I mean, like Yuchi, my background is a little more academics based, so you know, I think of it as having not so much a thesis, although that's pretty much what it is. It's just like a theme, the theme of like why you're telling the story, the core message. And I do agree that as both of them have stated, really helps inform the kind of research you're going to do. I would add that like one resource that I've been using a lot is my university catalog. Even though I graduated, it's still open to me amazingly. So, I take advantage of that because there's a wealth of academic sources there, as well as like peer-reviewed sources, interviews, etc. And their online library is also still available to many students, even if they've graduated, as long as they still have the email. Documentaries are also a good source, but the one that I use probably the most is just talking to people with a background in that. If I can't find the information that I need, I've always kind of viewed it as going straight to the source or as close to the source as I can get. For example, speaking to professors who, are intimately aware of the, maybe the culture or the language or the food. I mean, there are food professors. Or even going to that country and speaking to people. Not everybody can, but for example, I was able to speak to professors and experts who lived in Japan about certain things that I needed to know, and to just kind of tell them what I was reading and see if it matched up. So I think that that's a really good thing to do. But you can also just speak to people who are living that culture every single day. I do think there's a hesitation sometimes in the writing community to just talk to people, like just ask them questions. Of course, be mindful and be sensitive. Make sure you're not being rude or in any way. Some questions are just not as refined as they could be. But being mindful when you approach it and saying, I'd like to learn about your experience, and kind of hearing different perspectives, I think is a good source of research. But overall, with my 2 cents on the websites, I think a university website and their catalog is extremely valuable in research, as well as your public library.
I agree.
Do you have any tips for how to avoid getting lost in that research rabbit hole?
I'm a little torn because I think some people need the rabbit hole. I think some people need to let go and go down the rabbit hole if they're not quite sure what it is they're doing yet. They need to have fun sometimes with writing. Um, but I think having, for those who, are ready to write, you need some sort of foundational knowledge, and you should try to stick with that by narrowing down the scope of what you're looking for and try your best not to click on anything else. But I mean, the internet, you click on everything. So I'm not entirely sure. It can be avoided by, for some people, just because they might need the rabbit hole to get the juices flowing, to think about their story a bit differently, to see what applies. I think having a broad view and then narrowing it might actually work for some writers. But that's just, I'm torn.
I think, yeah, I think the rabbit hole can be beneficial. And the rabbit hole simply just meaning when you're totally immersed and you're asking questions and just absorbing information that you didn't even think that you were going to need or would be interested in. I would say it goes back, kind of goes back to your purpose. Are you, and I guess the easiest thing for me to do is use my own experience. I have a bit of background because one of my degrees is in African and African American studies, and so that was and African and African American studies are two different fields, and then even African studies quotes is can be divided into lots of different subgroups. But did you have it? I think the question: did you have an interest in this naturally that you just wanted to know more about, or did you want to do this research with the aim to write a story and you just wanted information to contextualize your story and make sure that it's authentic? Neither answer is wrong or right. You could have said, I want to write a story about this, and then you end up just spending months doing the research, and that's not time lost. I think that's time spent learning, and that's never a bad thing. But if your goal was to write a story, what I would say is, if you went in trying to write a story, and then you look up and 2 months have gone by and you haven't written a single word because you've gotten consumed by the research, then it might be time to not stop the research, but press pause and see what you can get down on the page. And the research is not going anywhere. The thing is, people are adding to these canons every day. So it's not like you have to stop researching forever. It's just, you can take a break and start writing and then come back to it when you have more questions or more time. But I actually don't think that the rabbit hole is a bad thing either, unless your goal is to complete a story. If your goal is to complete a story, at some point you do have to press pause and actually write, which is the hardest thing for all authors, funnily. Just, you have to write a story. But yeah, that's my own 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with what others have said about how the rabbit hole can be very useful. Um, and at the same time, I think having a lot of information can sometimes lead to paralysis where you have more maybe knowledge than you need, and which is all very good, but it can overwhelm sometimes. So I think with balance is always good, and one way to maybe stay on track is, I know we've mentioned like asking questions. So when you have those questions that you're trying to answer, if during your research you feel like you've gained sufficient information to be able to answer the questions you originally outlined, then maybe that's a good point to hit pause on the research and then to start writing. And then, of course, if something sparks your interest that's unrelated to the question, once you have the time to do so, to go back and indulge in going down the rabbit hole.
Well, since it seems like the rabbit hole is a good thing, but also that research is not just a one section of writing that is done, at one point. What types of research do you really feel not needs to be done, but people kind of break up writing into before, during, and after. And if research is done throughout the entire process, do you have any tips for what type of research should be done, before, during, and even after you finish your first draft?
I think I was going to say, I think that the before and during are very similar in that you're asking a lot of why questions and there's a lot of probing that happens. So this is where I said, if you draft a story, and let's just say hypothetically, I write fantasy, so you're writing a story, and you know that there's going to be a fight scene early on. Um, the immediate question is, okay, what does and what did combat look like in this world? If you're basing it off of history, again, you know that there were certain types of weapons utilized at a certain time in certain societies. That's a given because all societies need some sort of weaponry or defense system. If you're going to use, say, swords, which is a popular weapon choice in fantasy, then you probably need to do some research on swords. What kinds of swords would be most practical to use? Incidentally, having a sword made of solid gold would be problematic. If you know anything about weaponry and how heavy a sword made of solid gold would be, as cool as it might sound. So there's a lot of probing, I think, in the before and during stages. This is why it's so important to get critique partners and beta readers, people with other lived experiences that can say, hey, I know this sounds really cool, but I don't think the gold sword thing, I mean, can we tweak that? Getting outside eyes on it, I think is important. The after stage, I think that's a lot of fact checking. And the wonderful thing about, at least for traditional publication, that process is that happens. You do the fact checking research after, but you also have sometimes people who are there to help you, like a copy editor. I'm at the stage with Beasts of Prey, my debut, where we just finished copy editing, and it was really fun because I love monsters. I told you all I love animals, so there are lots of animals and beasts in Beasts of Prey, funnily. And so my copy editor was like, oh yes, this particular animal can kill a human being in 30 minutes or less. And I'm like, yes, research paid off. But they are fact checking and saying, okay, is this true? Is this plausible? Does this work? So I think part one and part two are probing and lots of how and why and what if, like I said before. And then on the back end of things, it's okay, does this actually work? Is this actually true? Have you checked to make sure this is actually what they would have worn, they being the people in your world? How long does it take to get from X city to X city? Like, could we have done that in a week? And if so, how did they travel? Like, so I could go on and on, but the bottom line being, I think that a lot of the fact checking research happens after the story is on the page.
Yeah, I think research is definitely a continuous process that happens before, during, and after. Because I know with my story, it's evolved quite a bit as I've written it. So, um, some things that I had in mind at the beginning ended up changing as I went along. And a wonderful critique partner pointed something out to me after she read the whole manuscript that I thought was a really good point. Like in the first few chapters of my book, I talk a lot about Manchurian culture and history because my ancestors are Manchurian. And then she pointed out that toward the like latter half of the book, that piece gets lost. And I was like, "Oh, you're right." And in my mind, it was very natural because I knew that with the history, like, Manchurian culture and identity did fade kind of, as time went on due to a lot of the political reasons that were happening, um, and the political, like, change in Chinese society. But the thing is I didn't, uh, make that very clear on the page itself as to why that identity started fading over time. So that, her question led me to do research after the manuscript was written to supplement that information. So I ended up reading, some some books in Chinese that talk about this and going back and weaving more details in to make it clearer as to, why this happened. So the research is sometimes when you think that you're done, you're not actually done. And I think, yeah, that's why critique partners are so valuable. They can point out additional questions that maybe are in your head but didn't make it onto the page and, yeah, and cause more research to be needed.
Yeah, I certainly think that, sometimes we tend to focus on all the research at the beginning, but I've learned, at least with my projects, that there's no end to it really. I finished the beginning of the book, I finished the whole book, the beginning changes, have to go back and adjust kind of information that's there. So I think it's important to stress, like, to writers, especially newer writers, that it's perfectly okay if you have just enough that you can answer your questions and just put some stuff down on paper. um, Start writing the story a bit, because those questions can change. When you go back and rewrite or re-edit. I think I've rewritten this thing like 4 times. It's in the nice version now. But I've had to alter things as I went. I've had to do more research or different research, to make sure that what I'm writing is in line with what is true. Um, and so I think that the beginning, the middle, and the end of research, it's just important to know that those things happen for a lot of people, especially the end with the fact checking. I mean, that's something I've had personal experience with a really old project where, for reasons unknown, I got like a popped out shoulder all weird in the writing. And I actually had a really good editor point it out. And I wouldn't have really known. I didn't think of research the same way as I do now. I mean, this was a long time ago. So I didn't think about researching anatomy. I didn't think about researching the body, because I figured, well, this is what I think would hurt. So um, I think as you go through the different stages of writing and editing, you'll find that you may need to do additional research, and sometimes your questions may have changed, and that's all perfectly fine. It's just part of the writing process and editing process, and part of the fun, in my opinion. I like researching, so it's fun for me. I think a problem that can stem from it is when people research so much that they never get to the writing phase, like, ever, or they believe that they can't write until they know absolutely everything. And I think that, you don't need to know absolutely everything. That's a part of the process. As you go back, you'll see the holes, you'll see anything that you need to, and you can adjust accordingly. Did that answer the question?
Oh, yeah, most definitely. And actually, that kind of led me to a follow-up of not knowing absolutely everything, kind of aspect of that was suggested that we talk about from the community is, when can you sacrifice facts for the sake of storytelling?
I would say in nonfiction, you can't.
Yeah.
It's probably different, between fiction and nonfiction, but definitely in nonfiction, you have to, um, stick to the integrity of what happened, but with creative nonfiction, there are ways to, um, not it's with creative nonfiction, it's this interesting kind of, um area because you still have to be truthful. You can't make anything up, but you can be creative in the way that you tell the story. And that's why I love narrative nonfiction so much, because it's still very much story driven. And when done well, it almost reads like fiction, yet everything is true. But the way you, like, write it, it can still be, like, really engaging and just feel like a page turner, but, um, definitely with nonfiction, you can't really bend the truth. You can add your, like, interpretation, your perception and perspective and things like that, but you can't make up things.
No, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for most publishers of creative nonfiction and nonfiction, they usually say that they fact check. Correct? I've only I've only written to, I think, one or two in my life, but they all seem to put a little thing at the bottom saying that, it has to be, to some regards, factually correct at the end of the day.
I would I would like to think so. I haven't reached that stage yet. Hopefully we'll go on submission soon, but once I get there, yeah, I would imagine that would be the case. I know there have been, like, in the nonfiction world, certain scandals that happen, especially in the memoir space, where authors have, said, "This is all true. This is my lived experience," and that creates, like, trust between the author and reader, but then later it came to light that some of the things in the memoir were, like, made up, and that broke a lot of readers' trust, and it can ruin careers, so it's definitely not something to be taken lightly in nonfiction.
Um, I can speak to the fiction side of it, and that's an interesting question because so you have obviously you have nonfiction, you have fiction, and then within fiction, of course, there are different age categories and genres. And I would say the first thing within fiction is it depends on the genre because yes, fiction is sometimes is made up in a sense, but also for example, I read a lot of historical fiction, and there's still a tremendous amount of research, even though a lot of it is often made up. A lot of fact checking in history that needs to be done there, and you'll see. I did this with Beasts of Prey, even though I don't call Beasts of Prey historical fiction. You'll see a lot of authors' notes at the end where authors discuss, the liberties they may have taken and, why they took those liberties, because especially readers of those genres are very picky about, well, this didn't happen. Um, and why did you do this? And I remember Kate Quinn is one of my favorite historical fiction authors. She's written about the Renaissance era. She's written about ancient Rome. She's now writing about kind of World War I and II era. But there was someone who complained because she had a reference to nail polish in ancient Rome. And so people are very, very picky about that stuff, the smallest liberties that are taken. So with historical fiction authors, they often have to kind of discuss, here are the liberties I took and why, and they still actually have to stay pretty close to actual accurate history. I think when you get into the speculative areas, science fiction, fantasy, genre bending areas, contemporary is another place where because believe it or not, historical fiction goes all the way into the early 2000s. I know that's probably weird, but historical fiction is now considered part of the 2000s. So if you have iPhones in the early 2000s and someone's reading it and they're like, wait a second, iPhones were not a thing in the early 2000s. What that does, and this all kind of ties in, you have this thing kind of called suspense of belief. And you can, I think, warp and distort accuracies to a point, but when it gets to when it gets to a point where it no longer feels believable, that's kind of the threshold, and that's for contemporary historical fiction. But over on the fantasy and science fiction side, again, I mentioned the golden sword. We know that people are not walking around with swords today, calling duels and battles in the street, thank goodness. But there are very few worlds where having somebody with a golden sword is ever going to feel plausible or feasible. With Game of Thrones, for example, which was a really big epic fantasy television series and obviously ongoing book series, there are people who raise questions all the time about what's realistic and feasible within even that world. So I would say you can, to an extent, push historical accuracy and plausibility, but it has to feel believable. Again, there's really not any kind of world where somebody could walk on their 2 feet 10 miles in an hour. At some point, it's just not realistic no matter what. Now, they could fly on a dragon, perhaps, in an hour. That might, if that's what you've incorporated into your world, sure. But you have to create a world that supports that and makes that still feel believable. And that's kind of the fun of being a writer, is playing with those truths and moving things around to suit the narrative that you need. It has to feel believable. And there was something I was going to say about it, but I've lost it. And so just the complicated answer is it truly depends. I was going to say there's an author who writes adult fantasy, but I think, and she has a background in history and is really, really great about this. And her name is S.A. Chakraborty. She wrote The City of Brass, Dalbabad trilogy, and is a scholar of specifically, I believe, Egyptian history. And she's got so much history in her work. And she's also got flying carpets and jinn and lots of really cool creatures. But you can just tell that she's really spent the time and doing the research and the work so that even the most fantastical things still feel plausible. A magic carpet ride still takes a certain amount of time, and she's clearly thought that out so that you believe it. So if anybody wants a good fantasy reference for really good research, I would say The City of Brass and the books that follow that series are a really great reference point.
Yeah, I agree with you with it has to feel realistic. I would, for me, I would say it has to make sense to the reader. Like they have to be able to wrap their head around it to some extent, or it has to be able to make them think, at least in some logical fashion of, okay, maybe I could see that working. So like you said, I would say that with some speculative fiction, though, it really depends. I read a lot of science fiction, and depending on the subgenre, facts may or may not be a little more necessary. Like a harder sci-fi is going to be a little closer to being scientifically factual than a soft sci-fi, for example. I feel like a cyberpunk is kind of in between because it does address some sort of socioeconomic, cultural, things that are still affecting us today. So there are some aspects of that are factual, but the technology isn't stuff that we would necessarily. I mean, we have computers today, for example. We don't have computers inside of people, so it sort of trespasses over that line, but it's still just over the line that we can still believe it. We can still kind of understand and see beyond that technology. And so I think it can vary with different types of fiction, depending on the subgenre. A contemporary fantasy I might expect to be a little more factual with the world that we live in versus maybe a high fantasy, though both require a lot of research. They may apply the research in different ways depending on the audience. And so I think, like you said, pretty much, it can really vary. And it's something that I think you have to just be aware of your genre and what's expected, not just by readers, but by publishers in your genre, and the standards of which, like how much you can bend the truth, and just kind of be aware of those things as you're writing so that you can create a story that's engaging to people, and you can feel content with what you've written, that you've done everything that you could. And I think that's all I had to comment on it, because everybody else said it so well. So
the answer is always it depends.
It's so subjective. Like I feel so horrible telling people sometimes, but literally 95% of the time my answer is, well, it depends. It's just it. I think that's the beauty and the curse of writing, is that it can be so subjective, and because we're all different people, we all have, different ways of doing things, different ways of seeing the world, so different ways of learning. So it's expected that, there wouldn't be a standard, like one very strict thing. But I think at the end of the day, just knowing what it is you intend to write, knowing what you need to know to write it, and understanding your genre or market's particular expectations of what goes into writing it is just important to be mindful of, so that you can do the best you can. So,
Agreed.
So I have a wild card question, and I didn't prepare any of you for this, so I apologize. But this kind of came out of this discussion, and it probably skews more towards the historical fiction than nonfiction. But history is not set in stone. Like we don't, or at least from my knowledge, we don't know 100% of the facts about everything. And history to me is really a living, breathing entity that we're always learning more about with new discoveries. So, how do you address if you write something now and a year from now new facts come out that maybe history, the written record was incorrect? How do you go about, do you have any tips for like addressing that something you wrote in the past might not be historically accurate anymore?
Um, I would say just sharing that knowledge with other people and letting them know that you wrote it the best you could at the time that the information was available, because you can't really go back and, well, I guess you could in some instances go back depending on, if you're in indie or self-published, you could go back and adjust it so that it's more correct, or in line with the new information that's come out. But I think just sharing that information with your readers and letting them know that this is the updated information available and it may not align with what's in your story is, being honest and forthright with that is important to me at least.
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one that I've wondered about too, because history itself, as you mentioned, Frank, it is shifting and evolving because as new perspectives come forth and as new scholarship is revealed, um, our understanding of what happened changes. And as we probably all know, history is written by the victors. And so there's a lot of stuff that gets left out. And it's all subjective. Like the people who are recording and documenting history, we're all biased as humans. And so we're all coming to information in the past with like our own unique lens, and that can definitely affect the way the truth is presented. Um, in addition, like memories, there have been studies that show memories change over time. So I feel like that's also connected to this question of how history evolves with time. Like we may look back at a memory at one phase in our life and feel a certain way about it. And then as time goes on, feel another way about it. So it's the perspectives are always shifting and changing. I think to like mitigate, um, it's useful to cite when possible with like, the historical, the nonfiction side of things, because it demonstrates you're doing your due diligence. If questions are raised earlier, you can go back to the source to where you found that material. And also, like Ari said, if more information comes to light later on, you can update your work, perhaps, yeah, or like share that, you know, there's been new information that's been revealed. But I think like that's why like in academia and maybe some historical nonfiction writing, it's good to include multiple perspectives um, and have them be kind of in dialogue with each other. And that way you're not just telling like a single story and you're drawing from like a bunch of different perspectives on what happened. And that can, adding that diversity can create and introduce a lot of nuance. And I feel um, like a lot of writing that is nuanced usually gets closer to accuracy.
Um, I agree, and I would say we I think we mentioned earlier that research and writing, these are things that we love to do and passions that we have. But I think you also need certain values as you go into writing, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. One of the most important is honesty, whether no matter what you're writing. And I think being very honest about the fact that, hey, I'm like anybody else. I'm learning every day. I'm learning new things. New discoveries are being uncovered all the time. And so in the case of historical fiction, Frank, you know if there was, say, some sort of groundbreaking information that the son of a king ended up not being his actual son, and or we thought that this person was dead, but they actually ended up living an extra 20 years, and whatever great discovery that we were to uncover. When that sort of thing happens, I don't think it's a moment where you have to feel badly as the writer if you didn't include that information because you didn't know. The way to, I wouldn't say circumvent, the way to address it is just to say, hey, I did the best I could with the information I had, and don't speak in absolutes. Be honest and forthright about the fact that, certain components of the history are still ambiguous. We don't know, and we're learning every day. And if you get it wrong, admit that you got it wrong. And people are not going to come to your house with pitchforks, I certainly hope. Um, it's just about being honest and transparent about the fact that research in history is ongoing, and also history is told by the victors. So we're getting new perspectives all the time, and that's a good thing. That's adding context. That's adding layers and richness to the stories of real people that have existed in this world, and not even history. We're getting new stories in present day about things that are happening right now. So I think it's not a bad thing at all. Embrace it, encourage it, and just be really forthright and again honest about the fact that we're learning all the time. And if you're able to go back and adjust, do it. But if not, own it and embrace it and say, here's a lesson that I learned from this experience. And then as you move forward, of course, and write your next book, take that new knowledge that you've gotten and apply it to your next work.
So now you've done your research, you've done at least your first part of your research, you're going in to start writing, but you have a massive amount of research. Do you have any tips or tricks for how to organize all of your notes?
Yes. I'm old-fashioned. I put everything in a binder, and I keep it on at least 2 other files. So I have a passport that I save everything into, and then I also put it on a cloud server because I do not want to lose anything ever again. I'm paranoid about losing things. Usually the first go, everything just ends up on one big piece of art paper with bubbles and lines and arrows, and it's a mess. And then I go through and I do macro tabs of world, magic, location, people. They're color coded. And then I do a sub tab, and I keep it in a binder because I get distracted on the internet a lot. So having it there physically, I can easily look at it while I'm in my offline, typing thing if I need to reference anything, or it's always on my desk. So I think keeping a physical copy with macro tabs and sub tabs have worked out pretty well for me, although it's heavy. So um, that and saving it to multiple places as well. Please save everything.
Yes.
And I think Yuchi mentioned earlier about sources and citations, I still do the academic thing of keeping my citations with whatever I've looked up. So if it's something that's free on the internet, I'll print it off so that I can see where it's come from and put a couple notes on it as to why I printed that off and put it in that section in the binder of where it needs to go. Or if it's a book at the library, sometimes they let you scan a couple pages. Sometimes. Other times I may just have to write down the citation information and then just make a note of why I'm using that. And that way I can always go back and see the connection between what's in the binder and the source, because sometimes you can forget why you even look something up. So I try to keep it organized because I find that being too disorganized is really stressful for me, and I tend to lose everything. So binders and extra saving areas is always my thing. So you should try it out. Everyone should try it. One.
I'm a fan of binders as well, and because of the high school that I attended and in the college that I attended, there's something very calming about that binder method, and I like it myself. For academic and non-academic work, it just what it does is it allows you to find things very easily, especially after you've read 5, 10 different books and you're trying to remember where was that one fact about XYZ. I really like the binder method. It's interesting. I've had to evolve a little bit not because I don't like binders, I still do, but because I've had to move around so much and my life has become more transient in my mid and late 20s. I've had to do a lot more electronically. And so, in addition to the binder, which I still have, I also really like I like Google Docs. Just putting in my Google Docs plug, just because Google Docs is if I have internet connection, and sometimes even if I don't have internet connection, I can access it anywhere. I really appreciate that, but I also really enjoy Scrivener, which is the closest I've found to having some sort of an electronic binder. Scrivener is a writing app software. It's fairly inexpensive. It's a one-time buy, I think maybe $50, and I've had it for years. And what it does is it allows you to create folders and subfolders and notes. And so I'll keep I tend, and it's weird. I have a very weird process for my writing, but I tend to, and I can go into a whole. I'm trying to like rein myself in. Oftentimes, I will do my first draft in Scrivener because there's word counts and there's a lot of just cool features. But I'm also able to house a lot of my research there and have folders, like a world building folder, and all of my world building stuff goes in one spot, and I can just click over to it and then click back to my story, and it's all very very easy for me. And then once I have a semi-coherent draft, I will often move over to Google Docs, just because it's a live document. It automatically saves, and I can access it on my phone or on my computer or anywhere I go. Whereas Scrivener is just housed on my laptop, so I have to have my laptop. But there are different methods, and I think there's the old "it depends" answer again.
And we're coming up on the hour, so I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. And we'll be continuing this discussion on our Discord channel. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask.